People in South Florida have started their spring cleaning a little early this year by rounding up green iguanas in their gardens and on sidewalks and streets.
Something unusual has been happening along the canal banks and seawalls of South Florida. In neighborhoods where green iguanas once crowded every flat surface in numbers that seemed impossible to reduce, populations are fluctuating in ways that human removal programs cannot fully account for. Wildlife managers, who have spent years tracking the species, are noticing patterns that do not align neatly with culling records or cold weather events. The disappearance of iguanas from certain corridors is happening faster than reproduction rates and removal statistics can explain, and the force driving it is not the one most Florida residents would name if you ask them. It is not the removal crews working the canal edges. It is not the licensed trappers charging by the animal. And it is not the occasional winter cold snap that sends lizards tumbling from their tree branches in a state of thermal paralysis. The real pressure on Florida's iguana population is something older, more distributed, and far more biologically sophisticated than any program a government agency has designed. Understanding it requires going back to the beginning of how green iguanas came to own South Florida in the first place, and what the ecosystem has quietly been doing about it ever since. Green iguanas are not native to Florida. They arrived through the exotic pet trade, with the earliest established populations appearing in Miami-Dade County during the 1960s. Animals escaped or were deliberately released by owners who underestimated how large a juvenile iguana would eventually become. Florida's climate, particularly in its southern counties, was close enough to the tropical environments of Central and South America that the species did not merely survive. It thrived beyond any reasonable projection. By the early 2000s, populations had spread through Broward County and into Palm Beach County, moving along the canal networks that lace South Florida's landscape like an artificial river system. Those canals, built for flood control and water management, turned out to be perfectly suited to iguana dispersal. Linear, warm, bordered by vegetation, and largely undisturbed by human activity at the water's edge, they functioned as highways connecting one suburban neighborhood to the next. By the time wildlife managers began treating the situation as a genuine ecological crisis, the population had already reached a scale that made conventional control strategies look inadequate from the outset. In 2019, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission removed green iguanas from the state's protected species list, effectively reclassifying them as an invasive nuisance on private land. Residents were permitted to kill iguanas on their property year-round without a permit, and a professional removal industry expanded rapidly in response. Contractors operating across Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties began reporting removals in the hundreds per coordinated effort, with annual totals across the state reaching into the tens of thousands. The economics were straightforward. Removal services typically charge between $50 and $150 per animal depending on property conditions and local density. From a business perspective, the model worked. From an ecological perspective, the results were considerably more complicated. Population estimates remained in the hundreds of thousands to potentially over 1 million individuals despite sustained removal pressure. The biology of the species explained why. Female green iguanas produce between 20 and 70 eggs per clutch, and in Florida's warm climate many are capable of producing more than one clutch annually. The arithmetic of reproduction consistently outpaced the arithmetic of removal. Wildlife biologists described it in terms of equilibrium dynamics. Removal reduced current density, but reproductive output restored populations to baseline within a single breeding cycle, particularly during warm years when hatching success was high. The structural problem with human-led removal extended beyond reproductive biology. Removal efforts were geographically fragmented, driven by private property demand rather than coordinated ecological strategy. A single neighborhood might aggressively target iguanas, while adjacent areas did nothing, and iguanas, highly mobile and adapted to moving along drainage infrastructure, simply migrated across untreated zones and refilled cleared areas within weeks. Ecologists describe this as source sink dynamics. Heavily managed areas act as temporary population sinks, but surrounding unmanaged zones act as continuous source populations, supplying new individuals faster than local removal can compensate. In South Florida's interconnected canal landscape, this dynamic plays out across entire counties simultaneously, making landscape-level suppression through culling alone a logistical and financial impossibility. The University of Florida's IFAS Extension and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission have both noted in published assessments that while localized density reductions are achievable, sustained population suppression across large geographic areas has not been demonstrated through removal programs. What culling achieves in practice is pressure modulation, a reduction in visible density in targeted areas, rather than genuine population decline at the scale of the invasion. This is where the real story begins, because while human intervention has struggled to shift the long-term trajectory of Florida's iguana population, the ecosystem itself has been applying pressure through mechanisms that operate continuously, invisibly, and across the entire geographic range of the species simultaneously. The most consequential of these mechanisms does not involve adult iguanas at all. It operates in the narrow biological window between egg deposition and juvenile survival, and the primary agent is an animal that most Florida residents consider a backyard pest rather than an ecological regulator. Raccoons patrol the canal edges and wetland margins of South Florida at night with a methodical efficiency that wildlife researchers have come to respect.
Female iguanas prefer loose, sandy, disturbed soils for nesting, the same substrates created by canal construction and suburban landscaping throughout the region. These nesting locations are predictable, and raccoons exploit that predictability with remarkable consistency. Using olfactory cues, they detect the faint chemical signature of freshly turned soil or organic traces left during egg laying, and once a nest is located, the excavation is rapid. A single raccoon can destroy an entire clutch, anywhere from 20 to 70 eggs, in a matter of minutes. Field experiments conducted at monitored sites in Florida demonstrated the scale of this impact directly. When raccoon access to nesting areas was restricted through exclusion fencing, iguana hatchling survival rates increased sharply, in some plots doubling or tripling within a single breeding season. This establishes raccoons not simply as predators of opportunity, but as active regulators of iguana recruitment, the process by which new individuals enter the breeding population. The second phase of raccoon predation targets the emergence event itself. After incubation periods of roughly 90 days, iguana hatchlings surface from nest burrows in synchronized, concentrated bursts, often at dawn or dusk. These emergence events represent a brief window of extremely high prey density in a small geographic area, and raccoons, among the most adaptable and spatially aware predators in Florida's urban ecosystem, are consistently positioned to exploit them. In ecological terms, it is a pulse event, a temporary concentration of vulnerable prey that a sufficiently attentive predator can exploit with high efficiency. The cumulative effect of raccoon predation across the nesting season, replicated across thousands of nesting sites throughout the canal system, represents a level of population-level impact that no human removal program has matched per unit of effort or cost. Feral cats and free-ranging dogs operate in the same pressure layer, but through different mechanisms. Unlike raccoons, they do not systematically excavate nests. Their contribution comes at the dispersal phase, when hatchlings emerge from the nest and move through open or semi-open ground in search of vegetative cover. Hatchling iguanas at this stage are typically under 20 centimeters in length, fast enough to escape some threats, but exposed in ways that their adult counterparts never are. Cats are visual hunters capable of short, explosive bursts of speed, and in the lawn-dominated suburban landscapes of Broward County, where natural vegetation has been replaced by ornamental plantings that offer limited refuge, they represent a consistent source of juvenile mortality. Dogs contribute through opportunistic predation in residential zones, and while each individual encounter may seem ecologically trivial, the cumulative effect across densely populated neighborhoods during peak hatching periods is, according to field observations, genuinely significant. Rat snakes and other opportunistic constrictors add a third predator class in this ground-level layer, entering burrows and ambushing hatchlings in vegetated areas, particularly in less disturbed zones where snake populations remain relatively intact. What ecologists call a distributed filter operates through all of these ground-level predators simultaneously. No single species removes large numbers across the entire landscape, but collectively they intercept a substantial proportion of individuals at the earliest and most vulnerable stages of life. The filter is inconsistent. In heavily developed urban cores where predator diversity is reduced, more hatchlings survive. In semi-natural corridors where raccoons and other predators maintain higher activity levels, recruitment drops sharply. This variability is ecologically important because it means the filter is not simply present or absent. It exists on a gradient, and the strength of that gradient maps directly onto the local conditions of each patch of habitat within the broader invasion zone. Above the ground layer, aerial predation adds a second tier of pressure that operates with different targeting logic. The great horned owl is the most ecologically significant avian predator in this system. With a wingspan approaching 1.5 meters and talons capable of exerting crushing force comparable to a medium-sized mammal, it is capable of taking prey that most birds cannot attempt. Its hunting advantage is not purely physical. It lies in the owl's sensory architecture. Asymmetrical ear placement allows triangulation of sound in near-total darkness with exceptional precision, meaning that the slight movement of claws on bark or the rustle of leaves as a juvenile iguana repositions at dusk can trigger a strike. Great horned owls in South Florida often establish territories along canal banks and tree-lined seawalls, returning to the same perching and hunting zones night after night. Within those territories, juvenile iguana mortality during warmer months can be measurably elevated compared to adjacent areas without resident owl pairs. The hunting pattern is cyclical and localized. Within an owl's territory, the pressure is consistent, but a few kilometers away, in similar habitat, without that territory, survival rates may be substantially higher. Red-shouldered hawks and other daytime raptors contribute at the margins, but their effectiveness against iguanas is constrained by timing. Iguanas are most exposed during transitional low-light periods when these hawks are less active. The avian predation layer introduces a selectivity and variability into iguana mortality that ground predators do not, creating pockets of elevated pressure within a landscape that is otherwise moderately favorable to juvenile survival. The Florida panther occupies the apex of this predator hierarchy, but plays the smallest direct role in iguana population dynamics. By the early 1990s, the panther's population had collapsed to between 20 and 30 individuals as a result of decades of habitat destruction and inbreeding. A 1995 conservation intervention by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which introduced Texas pumas to restore genetic diversity, triggered a slow recovery that has since brought estimated numbers to between 120 and 230 individuals. This recovery represents one of the genuine conservation achievements of recent American wildlife management. Getting there will require understanding that the most powerful forces already working against the iguana in Florida are not the ones making headlines. They are the ones working silently, every night, along the canal edges of Miami-Dade and Broward counties, in the form of a raccoon following the scent of a freshly disturbed nest, and an owl dropping through the last light of evening towards something moving in the grass below.